Because I said what was on my mind. I made a lot of enemies. I made a lot
Welcome, everyone, to Science from the Fringe. I'm Professor Jay Bhattacharya. Today, I'm delighted to have with me my friend Vanessa Dylyn, who is the director, producer, everything of a new film called COVID Collateral. From my point of view, it is a must-watch that tells the story of what happened during the COVID era, often from the point of view of regular people who suffered from some of the decisions that were made in Canada. Canada is the primary focus in the movie, and Vanessa lives in Ontario, Canada, but really is emblematic of what happened everywhere when the lockdowns and the attempt to suppress the virus often led to really inhuman acts that led to tremendous suffering. Vanessa, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me on your show, Jay.
So Vanessa, can you start? Just let the audience know what's your background. Like, I know you've done a lot of other documentary films before. What was life like before the pandemic for you?
Well, I had been making. I've been a documentary filmmaker for about 20 years, and I've been running my own company for about 15 years. And I've always been interested in stories that affect people. I always ask myself, what does the public need to know right now? What is happening right now, and what doesn't the public know that they need to? So I've done films on brain science, which have been very popular. I've done arts biography also, films on terrorism. I've recently produced a film called Plastic People about the danger of microplastics on human
That's
health.
really well titled.
Yeah, and also a film that I produced called the Good Virus will be coming out soon, and it's about a novel approach to superbugs.
You've been doing science films for a long time. And some very successful ones as well, like the things that have. That I've heard of before the pandemic. And what was your experience like with those? Like the reception to those, I imagine, was quite good.
One very popular film done about 10 years ago with the artist Sting was difficult to pull off, but it was a very satisfying film because I had only done one film before that independently, but my ambition always exceeds my grasp. And so I thought there had been I had been thinking about the relationship between the brain and music. And I thought it would be great to have a film dealing with the relationship of the brain and music, exploring what does the brain tell us about why music is so important to us as human beings. And what can music tell us about how our brain works? And around that time that I'd been mulling this over in my mind, Dr. Dan Levitin out of the Montreal Neurological Institute wrote a book called "This Is Your Brain on Music."
I've read it. It's a fantastic book. Yeah.
And I almost had heart failure when I read the review in the Globe and Mail. So I got hold of Dan, and through a whole bunch of hurdles, he was finally on. And then I thought, okay, we need we can't get an opera singer to be part of this, even though I love opera. We have to get a pop musician, but a really good one. And so I thought, we need to get hold of Sting because Sting appears in Dan Levitin's book. So I crafted the most important email of my life when I sent it to Sting's agents. And eventually he said yes. So we just had to figure out, how do we construct this film around Sting and his brain? and so that was a highlight. And then I did a film. I did a film a few years after that called The Divided Brain, and that proved to be very popular, even though it was somewhat academic. And it was based on the work of Dr. Ian McGilchrist, the author of The Master and His Emissary. That was my first introduction to censorship, in that the film was absolutely fine, but I had an interesting speaker at my first screening, Dr. Jordan Peterson. And I thought the world was going to go up in flames. I couldn't get a publicist in Canada. This was in 2018, when he was at the height of his fame. And he appeared at that screening in Toronto because he admired Ian's work. And so that was my first introduction to the fact that there are other people out there that may not wish to see something get made.
So can people still find those old films? So before we head to COVID, I'm promising to get there. So where should they go look to find those older films?
Matterofactmedia.com.
Okay.
That's my company. You can find old films there on the store. Yeah.
I confess I've not seen either of those two films, but especially the Sting film. I mean, I love that book. I learned a lot about music as well as the brain there,
Yes.
I did not know about timbre. I have to say before I read the book, but the way that, but I think that anyways, I'm going to go find those films myself.
Thank you.
Now COVID. So COVID hits. It's 2020.
So exactly, and I did want to make a film. I mean, I live in Toronto, but I wanted to make a film that was North America centric. So I wanted to combine what happened in the U.S. and Canada, because it was pretty well it was very similar. So I started to become aware that there was news of a virus in China, and we eventually shut down in Canada. March 17th, 2020 was that kind of D-Day where most provinces shut down. I believe our first deaths from COVID were in late January of that year. So we pretty well shut down the same time as the U.S. did, and I was watching Canadian television. I was watching U.S. television. I was watching CNN, Fox also. So I got a pretty good idea of what was going on. So I started thinking about making the film for a number of reasons, because where I sat, I'm very attuned to the message behind what I'm seeing. And what I noticed, that there were some very credentialed scientists, such as yourself and Scott Atlas and Sunetra Gupta, Martin Kulldorff. I became aware of all of you and other scientists, and the fact that you had been speaking against lockdowns, but also that you were being pilloried in the media, you were being pilloried in your own universities, you were being criticized by big tech and on major media. So I thought there's something going on here, and then I noticed around me that a lot of people were suffering, and that the COVID restrictions made no sense, because there were people in the population that were shouldering a disproportionate amount of the burden. What I mean is that everything was shut down, so you've had small businesses that all went bankrupt around all through the U.S. and Canada. Small business people. You had deaths of despair, mental illness, because of the lockdowns, not because of COVID. And I noticed that at the same time that these small businesses were being shut down, all the big box stores stayed open. So the message was that you're going to get COVID if you buy your box of nails at your local hardware store, but not if you buy it at Home Depot. And I noticed too that that pre-vaccine, low-income people actually had to go out and show up for work, physically show up for work if they wanted to get paid. I'm talking about people who drove trucks across Canada and the U.S. People who, so that other people could stock our shelves, so that we could go shopping, so that other people could work in kitchens and make takeout food, so that other people could work in warehouses where we could order our Amazon packages. So there was a whole there was a whole class of low-income earners that were the ones that were basically sent out to shoulder the burden of this pandemic. And I thought something is going on here. This isn't fair. And so I started thinking about creating this film, and I approached most of the broadcasters across Canada. I thought it would be a hard sell. I mean, approaching any broadcaster is a hard sell because 90% of people, 90% of ideas just get shoved aside. But there was something different here. There was a hostility, even though
Well, I can give you some personal interactions with some of the Canadian media. After Martin Kuldarf, Sinatra Gupta, and I wrote the Great Barrington Declaration in October 2020, the CBC broadcast some like roundtable with some professors, all of whom not just hostile but like angry about the Great Barrington Declaration, mischaracterizing it as a call to let the virus rip. A friend of mine who's a Canadian lawyer alerted me to it. He said, "Well, you can complain to the ombudsman about the CBC's ombudsman, and at least you should have some chance to respond to the slander that they were airing." And the ombudsman said it was a fair piece. Even though they accused us of wanting to let the virus rip, which we never wanted to. I was really shocked, actually. I mean, I have to say, like, watching the Canadian response from the United States. I mean, I live in California. The California response was draconian. My kids were out of school for almost a year and a half, almost 2 years, and there was just like this fear in the air, palpably different than, for instance, when I go visit Florida. This almost like sort of a slavish devotion to interventions. The idea that you have to treat your neighbor like a biohazard. Canada was worse. Like when I visited Canada, it was worse than California. And what you describe about the way that low income people were treated, they used this Orwellian language, Vanessa. They said. You're an essential worker. That means you go out, you take the burden of keeping society going, while non-essential workers can sit at home, like essentially the laptop class. I mean, it's not even that large a fraction of the population. Maybe 20%, 30% of the population have jobs that could be replaced by Zoom, or could be done from Zoom. But that other 70, 80% of the population needed to bear the burden of all of civilization to keep the 20% safe. It seems so wrong to me, so fundamentally wrong.
Yes, because also the laptop class was paid in many instances, whether, let's say, they submitted work or not. There were many people who were in academic positions who were just paid. And there were people who were government workers who, yes, I mean, they expected some output from you, but these were people that were quite protected during the pandemic, and they had the advantage of supervising their children's education, making sure that the kid was on the computer doing his virtual work or homework, whereas a lot of the lower income people could not supervise their children, and their children. I mean, it's certainly in Ontario, the kids were out of school for almost 2 years. And I think, back to your point about the CBC and its one-sided it's one-sided take on the Great Barrington Declaration. I think part of it stems from the fact that the U.S. has a much more robust media than Canada does. We are a far more compliant civilization. We tend to veer more to the left. We tend not to be as independent as you Yankees are. And the other thing is, we're only 10% of your population, but we have the same landmass. So we're spread out across the country in about 4 or 5 large cities. And there isn't that kind of really boisterous back and forth with the media. You've got a very strong left of center media. You've got a very strong right of center media. We don't. We are pretty well center to left, and unfortunately, under Mr. Trudeau, we are even further left than we normally would be. So our media is just not as robust as yours is, and which is why my major, hope the film is getting out into Canada, but it's not getting out into the U.S. because of reasons of the very powerful censorship of Google.
I mean, so let's talk about the film first, and we'll talk about the censorship, and then let's devise strategies for getting around it, Vanessa. It's striking that as you talk about the politics of the media in Canada, what we're talking about is a COVID response that really damaged the working class. Anyone who wasn't in the laptop class, Canada has, through the pandemic, has had higher all-cause excess deaths, higher deaths than you would have expected, had there not been a pandemic, higher than Sweden, which didn't damage the working class so much because it had much more reasoned response to the pandemic, many fewer, much less reliance on lockdown. In fact, no reliance on lockdowns, no school closures. And a lot more like what I would have expected a left-wing response to be. In fact, it was a left-wing Swedish government that adopted that response. And yet you have a left-wing government in Canada that effectively abandoned the working class, that abandoned children. And you had a left-wing media, left-wing media that chair-led that abandonment of the working class. Probably like the best example of that is the treatment of the truckers' protests in 2022, where Justin Trudeau declared an emergency and used that emergency, the emergency caused by a protest, and then use that emergency to grab the bank accounts of the leaders of the protest and throw some of them in jail. They're still facing charges around this, I think, if I'm not
exactly. It was a disgraceful. It was an international disgrace against probably the most peaceful mass protest that we have seen in this country. We have seen violent protests in this country against pipelines, but because they align with the government's narrative, they're not treated very seriously. But because the truckers' protest was very much a big grassroots Canadian protest against severe government interventions, and especially around the vaccine issue. But you had the media conspiring you had the left-wing media conspiring to make up stories about Nazi flags and about these people were just awful right-wing. This was white supremacists are taking over. You had all of these ridiculous labels slapped onto these truckers who had been the ones pre-vaccine who had been driving trucks all over the U.S. and Canada. You had the salt of the earth people being demonized by a government that I believe personally, Mr. Trudeau, and I have never said this publicly. I believe Mr. Trudeau has a tremendous amount to answer for. I believe he is completely out of touch with the average person in this country, and he not only froze the bank accounts of the leaders of the convoy protest, but he froze the bank accounts of people who had been contributing $20, $50. There are many, many stories across this country of people who had their just ordinary people who contributed to the truckers' cause, and the banks went along with it. You can't make this up. It's an extraordinarily shameful period in our history.
So this is the environment in which you went to try to go get funding from the traditional sources inside Canada for the movie that's going to document this.
Honestly, Jay, if I knew now, if I knew then the kind of hurdles I would have to go through, and 2 lonely years of constant slogging, constant negativity, very, very lonely years, I don't know that I would have stuck my foot in this. But things get carried away. You're just kind of swept away. So I'll
tell you, Vanessa, I know you suffered a lot, but I'm so glad you did persevere, because the product you let's talk about the movie a bit. But like I just before we launch into that, I want to say it's going to be people are going to look back on your movie as a incredible piece of the stories that need to be remembered about the pandemic and how we managed it. I don't think your sacrifices for nothing, my friend.
Thank you. That's very, very kind of you.
Okay, so now the movie, the heart and soul. I mean, I'm in the movie, and I'm very sorry for making your movie worse as a result of that, Vanessa. But I say the heart and soul of the movie is the story of a family who has a son that gets sick during the pandemic, but it's not with COVID. Can you tell us about that story?
Yes. So this is a family from Nova Scotia, and it is the one powerful human story in this film. And this family had been just a normal, healthy, happy family. And their young son, I think he was 17 at the time, Kai, started to feel ill. And they took him to hospital. But because of lockdowns, they had to stay in their car while he was in the hospital. And they just sent him out, and they had given him a COVID test and sent him home. Anyway, over a period of a few days, maybe a week, he gets worse and worse. There are repeated visits to the hospital, and he can barely stand. And the hospital won't admit him because he has an open COVID test, meaning that it's a COVID test that has not been read yet. It hasn't been analyzed yet. Unfortunately, what happens is that the child becomes so ill that they finally admit him. He has a meningitis infection, and it's too late. It's just too late.
Yeah, this is the kind of thing if you have a competent emergency room, they'll detect it. They'll think about it as a possibility, give you antibiotics very early, and then the child survives. I mean, it's like, and that's the typical normal thing to happen. And yet, because of the COVID protocols, they send him home when they should have picked up the infection. The parents essentially defy medical orders, bringing him back a couple of times, and they don't even get to spend. They're not even allowed in the ER to be with him, to advocate for him. He's just alone, a 17-year-old alone, feeling very, very sick, and they send him home, and he dies.
Yes, and he actually dies in hospital, and the parents are allowed to see him at the very last moment when a nurse realizes that the young man is at death's door. And but I've watched that story so many times in the edit, and every time I watch it, I feel the same pain. And it's very emblematic of what happened when uh, to emblematic of what happened to us, that we became so tunnel visioned with COVID in our hospitals, that by looking for COVID under every park bench, we missed serious illnesses.
Yeah, I mean, I think that partly explains why Canada has had worse outcomes than Sweden through the pandemic, right? The human health is not just the avoidance of a single infectious disease. Human health is much broader than that, and people skipped cancer screening, and so are dying of late stage cancer as a result. There were people who died at home with heart attacks because they were told the hospitals are dangerous places to go during the pandemics. There are people who fell into deep depression, anxiety, and the drug overdose problem in Canada is absolutely enormous.
One thing that many people aren't aware of, and you just mentioned it, about people being frightened to go to hospitals when they were, when they, for their cancer treatment or their life-saving operations. I spoke to several doctors, and I was actually shocked about this, and they were rather embarrassed about it. And that is, they told me that their emergency rooms during COVID had been empty. And all over the media, we kept seeing overloaded hospitals, and of course that was the case, but that was the only picture we were seeing. We were not seeing many hospitals whose emergency rooms were quiet, because people had just been terrified to go to hospitals for care. And this human catastrophe, I think it's going to take us a good decade to actually parse this and to really analyze what happened.
You also have a series of interviews. I'm interviewed. I remember sitting down, by the way, for that interview. It was almost like 8-hour long interview. And you masterfully edited. I'm very sorry you had to listen to that so many times, Vanessa, in the edits.
No, it was a pleasure. It was a pleasure. You provided us with a lot of humanity in the film. What I call, I used to joke with my editor, and I used to say to him, Jay Bhattacharya is the New Testament and Scott Atlas is the Old Testament.
So, right. So my friend Scott Atlas also features in the film.
Yes.
Now, tell me about like how you chose the experts, and like what was your goal in sort of weaving together that human story we just talked about that young man who died essentially from as a collateral harm from the COVID response, and then the interviews. Because to me, that the key story is that we didn't have to do that. That there were other ways to protect the population that didn't involve sacrificing people like that young man Kai, and we would have done better even to protect the elderly had we followed that.
Exactly. Well, as the film, we had a number of researchers, story researchers, and we used to have meetings, and we used to, and because to me, to get a clean film, to make sure that I had a film that could be, that was of top quality, that could be sold internationally, I had to make sure that everyone on camera was highly respected. I could not have, even though I may have admired the more, I don't want to call them fringe scientists, because they're not fringe scientists.
I'm a fringe scientist, Vanessa, just apparently.
But we had to choose our experts very, very carefully and make sure that we had just top of the line experts, but also the people, the doctors and the scientists who had been the most affected by this whole suppression of science. And you and Scott Atlas obviously were two of the top ones, and then we had Dr. Paul Merrick, who was very useful for the ivermectin segment of the film. in terms of human stories, we had a number of human stories that we had to let go because the film has to tell a story. It has to give us the big picture of what happened. It has to take us from the initial announcement of COVID in China to what started happening in the U.S. and Canada. A film that's about 80 minutes, that's as much as people will, have the bandwidth to watch. So we had to be very careful as to how we weaved the interviews in with the human stories. And in the end, we could only afford to tell one major human story because we had so much else to pack into this film. The expert interviews, to me, are the backbone of this film.
I mean, I thought the interweaving of it was so effective. I mean, and the story it told essentially was experts who were ignoring contrary voices, alternate paths, and more important than that, they were ignoring the suffering in the population caused by their recommendations of lockdowns and school closures and the like. They were essentially designing a strategy that would at best protect the laptop class, while crushing the rest of society. And I think that and then in the process of doing that, they had to create this illusion that there was a consensus in favor of their strategy. And I thought you did quite a good job in the film interweaving the human story, because that's really the important part, right? The suffering that the population at large faced with this sort of scientific almost skullduggery that was going on to try to say that we had no other choice. We have to lock down. We have to close schools. We have to do all these things, or else grandma's going to die. And unfortunately, lots of older people died anyways, despite that.
Exactly. And certainly what we had to show also was we had to show out what was going on in the White House, because that was important. Because once the U.S. decides to lock down, it's a ripple effect, not just across the U.S., but across Canada. And so Scott Atlas's interview was extremely important. And I had read his book about his time in the White House. And Scott, along with you, Jay, Scott is one of my heroes. And Scott said some pretty blistering things that we have on camera, but he said even more blistering things that we did not put on camera, because I have an eye to libel also. And,
well, I think Scott, he was so bruised during his time in the White House in 2020. And he treated incredibly unfairly, especially by my colleagues here at our colleagues here at Stanford. The faculty senate at Stanford actually voted to, I mean, I don't know another word for it. They voted to excommunicate him. They censored him using religious language, like what he's saying is anathema.
Yes. Yeah.
So, and he's still quite angry over it. I don't know it's healthy for him to stay that angry, but I can understand why. Like he what he was telling President Trump in 2020 was open the schools. The kids are hurting, and there's lots of good evidence from Sweden and elsewhere that it's not helping anything. And he was telling the president that we're not protecting older people well enough, right? That we should do a better job with protecting older people. That we should use our testing resources wisely, not to keep kids out of school, but rather to protect nursing homes so that they're less likely to have COVID-infected patients enter the nursing homes, right? I think that was a very sensible message, and yet my colleagues treated it as if it were heresy of some sort.
Yes, and one thing that Scott did mention in his book was that what had shocked him when he was part of the coronavirus task force was that on that task force there weren't people from different disciplines that would have given a better perspective of the kind of policies to implement around COVID, and he kept talking about bringing a lot of data to meetings, but realizing that no matter how much data he brought to meetings, there was a certain mindset there. And this is certainly corroborated by the former head of the NIH, Francis Collins, at the end of our film who has a kind of a confessional moment. And it's one of my favorite parts in the film because it's someone who, and I hope the audience understands what he's saying when he says that there was a certain kind of mindset, a certain public health mindset that had taken over, and that the public health mindset says that you must save a life at any cost. Well, we don't run our society that way. And he said that they had not sufficiently taken into account all of the collateral damage, all of the suicides, mental health issues, bankruptcies. And he says, and that was very unfortunate. So at least there is an admission that things could have been handled very differently, and certainly, people may accuse me or others of having 2020 hindsight, but we're really talking about what was known at the time, what was known in 2020. What was known in 2020 was that children were not spreaders, were not significant spreaders of COVID, yet they were kept out of school.
I mean, at the very least, they weren't high risk of dying if they got COVID. And so that meant that if you're harming them in a bid to stop the virus from spreading, you're really harming them. They themselves are gaining no benefit. In fact, they're being harmed by the COVID, by the school closures. That's just unethical, right? And normally our societies, we think about protecting the vulnerable children most of all. At the idea that we should ask children to effectively suffer this harm for the benefit of someone like, older person like me, is an inversion of what I believe society should be about. Society should be about older people sacrificing for children, not the other way around. So Vanessa, since the film was done, what's happened to the film? How have you managed to get a distributor? Have you managed to find it? Because it's, as far as I can tell, it's not yet on the screens. It should be, but it's not yet on the screens.
We're hoping that an American streamer will pick it up. That's taking some time. It's taking time for the film to reach the U.S. audience because when I made the film available on my website, Google banned all ads in the film, and they slapped it by saying shocking content, but also they said election advertising in the United States.
Election advertising, that's nothing to do with the election.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess they felt that the film might sway the American voter. It's absolute madness. But even after the election, we just put out an ad to Google advertising the Dr. Drew podcast, and they slapped a warning saying unreliable claims. So they have really made a concerted effort to keep this film from reaching the U.S. public. So right now, the film is available on my website. We do have a European distributor that will take care of Europe, but we still, but the film still hasn't made inroads in the U.S.
And you took out loans, right? In order to, I mean, you personally are, have faced financial costs from producing this film. I mean, it's
yes, it has not been a pleasant experience, and I wish I hadn't done that.
History's going to remember that you've taken this sacrifice to do that, because it's I think that the film is an important historical document telling the story of the North American response to COVID, and sort of the foolishness of it. I want to end just by talking about a screening of the film that you and I are both at in Washington D.C. And it was at this screening, a man the Scott Atlas criticizes in the film, a man named Robert Redfield, who was the former CDC director, was in the audience attending, and he sat on a panel with us I should say, Vanessa, I now view Robert Redfield as a hero. I think he is an incredible, honest man, I think there's things I didn't agree with him in 2020 about how, but I've learned more about the context of the pressures he was facing inside the government, and I can understand the kinds of things that he faced, so that might explain why he would say things publicly that I didn't agree with. But I also, in meeting him and coming to know him, I've come to understand that he's a man of great integrity, actually, great courage. Why don't you describe what happened after you screened the film in Washington, D.C. with Robert Redfield in attendance? We had a little panel. To me, that was dramatic. I'm going to let you tell the story.
Yes, well, I was absolutely shocked that during the panel, Dr. Redfield said that he had been muzzled. He had been muzzled by Dr. Fauci, and he had been kept out of important meetings and important phone calls because he had been against lockdowns. And he had also been asked to stay away from the major press conference announcing shutdowns in the White House. And that was shocking to me. And he was very supportive of the film because he felt that it spoke for transparency in science. And to me, the most dramatic thing that he said was, science caused COVID, and science has to deal with it. Thus, in a sense, enlightening what we claim in the film which was that COVID probably accidentally leaked from a lab in China, and that there's a lot of evidence to show that is the most logical place where COVID came from. And to have Dr. Redfield like the film and also talk at length about the COVID lab leak was an immense relief.
Yeah, I mean, I think he was. I was also struck by his description of what happened in the White House. Tony Fauci essentially took over that task force, even though he was only the head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, not the person you would expect to be running the decision making in the pandemic. That should have been Dr. Redfield. I think it's difficult when you are. I imagine I've never been in this situation where you're part of this team of people that have to make a decision about what to do on something incredibly important that's going to impact every single human life on the face of the earth. You have to make a decision. I don't agree with the thing that's being decided. Do I go along? Do I try to internally change what's happening and make that choice? I think that's what the decision that Dr. Redfield ultimately did decide to do, and maybe he regrets that now. Or do I speak up publicly? And it's a hard choice, actually, because at the time you may not know you're right. I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty, right? And you have to decide in that context. If I start to speak up publicly from the inside, I may end up harming people. I mean, my job as an outsider, as a scientist outside, I believe is to speak up. But I also got that criticism, Vanessa, that because I was speaking up, I'm going to harm people somehow. I think if my strategy, the Great Barrington Declaration, had been followed, many fewer people would have been harmed, certainly children. But I think I can understand why Dr. Redfield made the choice that he did now, much better than I did in 2020. He spoke up on all the right points. First, that COVID very likely was a lab leak, and that meant that the scientists, many of whom were in the room making the decisions about what to do about lockdowns, they had also made the decisions that allowed the very dangerous research to happen in the first place. And then secondly, about the lockdowns. I was struck, actually, now this is, you can hear my personal bias in this, but I was struck in that in that panel after the showing of the movie in D.C., Dr. Redfield said that he, in retrospect, supported the Great Barrington Declaration, that it was the right strategy. And I have to say, when a leader is willing to say, I'm wrong, honestly and forthrightly, I have to have great respect for that leader. It's a very difficult thing to do, especially for leaders. And among the set of people that were involved in managing the pandemic, there's been very few that have been willing to do that, and he is among them. So as I said, I think I have a tremendous respect for him.
Yes, I think it was shocking, but I was extremely happy by the fact that he had that he had revealed what he had been thinking while in the early days of lockdown, and the kind of pushback that he had received. It would have been easy for him just to keep silent. But I know that he's been giving interviews to the BBC and saying things very similar to what he said during our screening. So I was very happy about that, and I have a great deal of respect for Dr. Redfield, but also a lot of sympathy for the difficult position that he was placed in.
One more reminder before I let you go: how can people see the film now, and then how can people help so that that you don't face such a sort of financial hit from? I mean, are there plans to do a GoFundMe or something to maybe that's something we can get going to try because I'd love to be able to help fund the film in some way.
I think right now the way people can help is just to go to the website covidcollateral.com, watch the film, and there is a button where you can donate. So if you're feeling generous and you really like the film, there are a number of ways in which you can donate. Also, if people, what would be wonderful is if we could have a lot of public screenings across the U.S. I'm sure there are medical science groups that would like to see the film, educators, legal groups, people who want to have their own screenings. We can certainly help with that.
Well, thank you, Vanessa, for talking with me today. It's been absolutely wonderful, delight. I'm sad we took so long to finally record this podcast, but I think this was such an interesting conversation. I hope people who are listening enjoyed it as much as I did. So this has been Professor Jay Bhattacharya on Science from the Fringe, talking to Vanessa Dylyn. Thank you, Vanessa, for appearing on the show.
Thank you, Jay. You've been very, very kind. Thank you.